Anything that comes up will belong. It's a starting point. It's getting some process into motion. I allow movement to emerge. In this case, it happens in front of a mirror, together with another dancer in the studio. We're both facing the mirror. I'm channeling these movements that I dance improvisationally. She observes, mimics, and memorizes. I check her version against mine, and maybe I'll adapt hers, adopt hers, or maybe I'll insist on my specific quality and form. So what's happening in these first few moments is already extremely complicated. Together, we hold that which emerges in our bodies and in our minds as we then engage in discussion verbally and kinetically by moving together. We're repeating these movements, deliberating their potential meanings and their qualities. They change their order, I change their order, or play with intensities and directions. This is an iterative process that takes place numerous times in rehearsal and after performances and in performances and again in rehearsal. Every piece remains a work in progress, always. It's a process of intuition and analysis that alternates, building stairs to a version of something that seems to get closer and closer to what I might call my intent. Sometimes this intent is known from the start, and sometimes I'm searching for it and it reveals itself at some point throughout the process. But it starts with improvisation and then becomes more and more clarified and refined. The video that you're seeing is in a moment of where we just have created movements, and now we're sort of working on their form, on their order, on the space, on the staging. Where in the space is she? And after that, things become more clarified, more detailed. So we keep working on the quality of the movement. Pina Bausch said, quote, "I know what I'm searching for, but I know it more precisely with my feeling than with my head. Therefore, when I come upon that moment, it's a specific moment, and I know exactly and with certainty that is part of it, it belongs. And it's a very exact feeling," end quote. So something settles at the bottom of the cup, something liminal. It's something that is both known and still unknown. So I need the dancer to repeat the movements often, over and over. And I'm externalizing, one could say outsourcing my experience to the dancer, shifting my perspective from direct experience to observation. By watching her, I start to understand what these movements are attached to. So as she's going through these movements for memory and, spacing, I'm starting to think about what is attached to these movements. What kind of knowledges they can pull from another realm into our understanding. But this is much more complex. I see her move in her specific way, the way only she moves, and at the same time I imagine how I moved, visualizing myself in the mirror, how I danced this particular movement, how I felt. I constantly hold the imprints of experience, her movements, my movements, her expressions, my known and unknown goals, and I keep them overlaid and playing together for the duration of the process of developing the piece. So it's a whole-bodied, multi-actional kind of cross-temporal approach that lies at the core of this, I think, omnidirectional reciprocal discovery that I call choreographing. By verbalizing feelings I see reflected in her body, I begin associating and gaining insights. I see, I feel, I remember, imagine, and I think. I can begin to allow words to flow in, drawing something into knowing, from the unknown into discourse. I can see where she's uncertain of a connection or a motivation, and I can help her find this, verbally, emotionally, physically, this sort of disconnect will manifest physically, which to me will look like she's skipping steps or leaving out elements of some kind of logokinetic chain. I observe energy flow, directions, emotional posture, muscular tone, dynamics. This helps me manifest and clarify my intent and help the dancer capture a specific feeling or thought. So then a subtext emerges within me, and sometimes I share all of this subtext, sometimes parts of it. It allows me to clarify my piece and set structures and follow important revelations that I'm having while I'm watching her. It allows me to communicate with the dancer more clearly, and it allows me to craft a logical narrative and the physical dynamic red thread that leads through the whole piece. So if the dancer loses this subtext, it all just doesn't fit together anymore, even if the movements are performed correctly, so to speak. So form is not enough. One section's narrative leads to and is part of a specific larger meaning and message that the piece in its entirety is attempting to discover and then convey, but which contains further layers of awareness, such as what comes before and after the scene. What's the dancer wearing? What does that mean? What's their personality? What's the story I'm telling? Where is this whole thing taking place? How does it relate to the audience? What's their role? What's the social political message and context, and so on. This process is endlessly complex and really difficult to describe. So I experience this whole process being initiated and facilitated by my entering a particular state of mind and revisiting it over and over. I find it helpful to call on Henri Bergson's theories around intuition. In his essay, Introduction to Metaphysics, he describes intuition as a process, a piercing through the quantitative multiplicity of the rationally cognitive, through the deterministic, categorizing, and analytical ways of thinking and seeing the world, and as an entering into the qualitative multiplicity and experiential complexity of being in the world, or even being the world. So I think one could say that Bergson might believe that in intuition, boundaries dissolve, engaging with and becoming the multiplicities of durations, which stops the habitual ways of labeling and thereby reducing that which we encounter. That allows for a process of knowledge acquisition of a different kind. An impression is still knowledge. So I would point towards experiencing the world in a more simultaneous way, more as a simultaneity, than in the attempted linearity of language, for example, even though I'm working with language. So I'm pulling knowledge from intuition, but I'm also attracting intuition into knowledge, keeping those doors open, traversing the connections between knowing and not knowing. And choreographing is the act of allowing for a flow of information in both directions. In between intuition and analysis lies trust, and trust is the connective tissue. It's what I rely on when navigating the world of intuition and the world of analysis. So I furthermore entrust my presence to a reciprocal process of intuitive emergence and an analytical contemplation that leads to a rearranging of choreographic material. So Alvanoe said this really poignantly. He said dance is a quote-unquote reorganizational practice. And I feel that that's what I'm doing with choreography. I'm reorganizing my world to understand it, and maybe also with the hope to change it through a discussion with audiences and through presenting this work. So when I'm observing the dancer, I'm not looking for whether her movements look exactly like mine, but whether they convey what I was trying to express. whether I think that she's experiencing what I felt and whether she could potentially make the audience empathize with what I felt when I come up with that movement in the studio. I'm not trying to tell the audience what to see or what to think, but I do want to be clear on what I'm expressing through this piece. I would like to be clear for myself and the dancer to be really clear about what this piece is meant to say, or what experiences I'm trying to give her to live through in dancing it. My piece is a proposition, a thesis statement, so to speak. And this process of communication requires further intuition. Intuition lies at the heart of knowing. So Bergson wrote, quote, "An absolute could only be given in an intuition, whilst everything else falls within the province of analysis. By intuition is meant the kind of intellectual sympathy by which one places oneself within an object in order to coincide with what is unique in it and consequently inexpressible," end quote. So to me, it sounds like Bergson is saying that there is greater precision in intuition than in analysis. By seeing the whole, we grasp connections that we cannot understand by looking at details. By assigning meanings, we define details. So this is funny because it therefore would render my sort of lifelong desire to gain awareness and knowledge is silly. Instead of all this thinking and analyzing, I could just be doing life instead. Well, so my process is a form of slowing down to see details, of analyzing the many steps that are needed in order to produce a movement or an emotion. Does a choreography that seeks to find meaning reinscribe deterministic ways of knowing? I would say my choreography is to movement what language is to vocalization. And I liken it to a process of a psychological becoming aware of a complexity of phenomena that act upon us and that we enact unknowingly. So improvisation is what I start this whole process with and continuously revisit it, can be a tool for navigating our emotional and psychological realms. Seeing complexity, or this intuition, if we see this for longer periods of time and learn to see it more clearly, we spend more time in the unknown and observing it, it can be a tool for letting go of categories and the need to know. Analysis helps me make sense of life. So there's this dichotomy or this seeming contradiction. Analysis helps me make sense of life. And I find the connections between socialization and experience, inner struggles and inequalities, life's forms and the rules of these forms, that they're becoming more clear through analysis. My process starts with and remains in constant rapport with intuition. I choose to make pieces over writing books. I cherish the enrichment I get from creating pieces and from creative processes and from this merging of entities, merging of intuition and analysis. The poet Rumi wrote, "Life is a balance of holding on and letting go." So, as in poetry, which assigns words in non-deterministic ways, so is my choreographic process. It's not finite in its attempt to create subtext for movement, space, sound, lighting, but I think instead the words in my play with approximations and relationships seeks to incite further intuiting, further analyzing. So through weeks of rehearsals, I have too much background information, which restricts my ability to see the piece with fresh eyes. And then my manifested knowing becomes a not knowing at the moment of exposure to an audience. All the while in my performing and dancing on stage, my energies shape and release more knowing through a heightened focus in which I revisit the movements and experience them with new attention. I enter these movements and they speak to me. Many times I have finally understood in performance what a specific movement I had chosen actually meant. Like I will hold on to movements not knowing, not being able to ascribe a subtext, knowing that maybe later that meaning will reveal itself. And so new knowing is acquired in different states of being, in rehearsal, in imagination, and in performance, and then later in discussion. I remain open to improvisation and change. The performance brings about a state of mind that allows for deepening the connections between intuition and analysis. This kind of knowing trusts intuition and doesn't exclude. So analysis, as I'm seeing it, can become more detail-oriented, more aware, and open. It can make us become more detail-oriented and more aware and more open. Analysis can be informed by the experiences we have in intuition, and it can help us develop a more profound relationship with intuition. Pina Bausch said, dance, dance, otherwise we are lost. I just kind of see it as an artist statement in a way, about a specific aspect. So I couldn't have somebody else talk about it because, I think the way I say it would be different than someone else says it. So it would probably mean something else. It's always difficult to listen to your own voice, I think. And I tried because I wrote this paper, right? And I was going to just read the paper. It was just terrible. I just don't I can't listen to people reading papers. So I tried to, be more conversational, but, yeah, I mean, largely also logistics. I just barely made it within the 15-minute, marks. And if I had done it live, perhaps I would have gone over and I didn't want to be cut off. And I was like, I'm just going to make this little package. And then it's also something I can step back and look at, which is what I always do, right? I put something out there and then I step back and look at it. So this piece is particularly difficult because this is Vita 5, so there have been 4 other renditions of it before. And some had like live sensor suits and things, and I worked with a composer, and the music that you didn't hear in this video, there's a sound score that goes with that was created by the dancer, so it had even more layers of complexity. But I don't remember exactly. I usually jump back and forth, but like I sort of imagine everything at the same time. So when I'm working in the video, I'm imagining being in the studio, and so that's that weird multi, all simultaneously happening sort of. Even though I might be working on one thing specifically, I'm always thinking about everything else. So yeah, I know I spent a lot of time editing and making that animation. Water is in almost all of my pieces for some reason. And I have to think, and I can't, you see me stumbling because I'm trying to like find that knowledge again, like how that came about. But yeah, it has something to do with water and with electricity and with drowning and with, like, at some point she goes all the way down under the ocean, into the dark parts of the ocean, and dies in a way, and then decides to struggle out and come back and swim back to the surface. So there's something about water, us being water, and also it gives life and it gives death. So there's a lot. It's also about identity, identifying with trees or identifying as a tree, being asked to live a human life, that kind of thing. And so then there's gender that comes into the picture as well. Sorry. Okay, so now I'm done. So when I answer questions like that, what does this mean? I have to enter back into intuition and then bring that back into language. So that takes a little bit of time.